For the first time ever, the US government's public debt has reached $34 trillion. I mean, man, look at all of those zeros. And for context, that's roughly $100,000 per person currently living in the country. So in this video, let's talk about the implications that this could have, why the rest of the world is laughing, and the 3 strategies the world is currently using to reduce the reliance on the United States and the dollar. But before we get into any of that, we need to talk about the impact this new record will have domestically within the United States. The $34 trillion mark was hit in January 2024, $33 trillion was hit in September 2023, and $32 trillion was hit in June of 2023. So basically, the country is at a $1 trillion pace for every 3 months. To put that into perspective, look at this article from the Washington Post in 1981 when the country celebrated their first $1 trillion in debt. So yeah, since the United States inception, it took until 1981 to hit their first trillion, and over the next 20 years, only about 5 trillion was added. I know. Comparing different time frames is like comparing apples to oranges, but basically this means that the last 20 or so years, there have been $28 trillion added to the public debt, and this current pace is extremely unsustainable, and quite honestly, it's a dangerous precedent going forward. If that doesn't concern you, maybe this will. $34 trillion represents the value of the economies of China, Germany, Japan, India, and the UK combined. And yes, those are the 2nd through 6th largest economies in the world. No wonder why the world wants to be less reliant on the United States, but more on that later on in the video. Because as debt exponentially rises, so too does the interest expense that comes along with it. It's projected that over the next 10 years, the US government will spend more on interest payments than it traditionally has on R&D, infrastructure, and education combined. The more money that the government spends on interest payments, that means the less capital it'll be able to use for things like growing its economy, infrastructure, social programs, etc., etc. And quite honestly, it just feels like the US government has been spending money with the illusion that they have unlimited resources, which we know is not true. Some will even argue that the United States can just print more cash to fix any fiscal problem, which again, we know is not true. Just look at what happened after the country printed all that money during the pandemic and the endless inflation that came from it. And no, this is not a left versus a right issue, but a larger overall systemic issue. And if the United States does not adjust their debt mindset, there are 3 problems they will face in the future. The first is it will raise the probability of another financial crisis. The second, it will hurt the United States economic growth, which could bring on unemployment, lower wages, etc. And third, it won't be able to spend as much on vital programs like Medicare or Veterans Affairs. While it's doom and gloom inside the US border, you can start to see the smiles around the world getting larger and larger, specifically the countries who are trying to reduce their reliance on the dollar. But before we get into that, I make videos about world news impacting the dollar and the US economy, so if you like videos like this and want to see more of them, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Countries around the world have been keeping an eye on the US debt crisis as well, and quite honestly, they want no part in it. In fact, countries around the world have been using 3 main strategies to reduce their reliance on the dollar and the United States as a whole. In order to add context to the 3 main strategies these countries have been using, we need to understand first how the global financial system has been working and why it's changing. For decades, the dollar has been the world's reserve currency, and with that status come 3 superpowers. The first is stability. Stability makes it much easier for international trade. Just like when you communicate with someone, you need a common language. In this case, a common currency is needed that everyone can agree on and know the value of the currency is reliable. So when things get tough financially around the world, investors run back to the dollar because they know that they can rely on it being the world's reserve currency. The second superpower of the world's reserve currency is its exclusivity to buy oil. Decades ago, countries from around the world met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in the United States, where it was decided gold would be the basis of the US dollar and essentially tied all currencies to the dollar. The dollar remained a powerhouse until the early 1970s when the United States ran out of money and was no longer able to continue their arrangement of dollars for gold. So when the gold deal ran out, why didn't countries just go back to using their local currencies? Because the dollar was tied so closely to oil purchases. purchases, the US made a deal with Saudi Arabia, making the dollar the only allowable currency to buy oil in. And this was the birth of what we know today as the petrodollar. So in order for countries to continue powering their country with oil, they needed to hold the US dollar to do so, making the dollar a necessity for countries around the world. The third advantage for the country with the world reserve currency is it becomes an investing juggernaut. Countries around the world have to hold the world reserve currency for international trade, and right now this is called the dollar wallet. And as I alluded to earlier, countries use the money in their dollar wallet as an intermediary currency and to purchase oil with. But countries don't use all the money in their dollar wallet, so instead of having it sit there losing purchasing power to inflation over time, the next best thing is to invest a majority of that money into US markets. Historically seen as one of the safest investments, the United States issues debt, otherwise known as bonds or treasuries, in which countries, corporations, and individual investors can give a lump sum investment in which they will receive back at the end of the loan with interest on top. And this is the first strategy being used by countries from around the world. US debt has been seen as an investing tool. Again, historically, it's been seen as one of the safest investments ever. But this form of investing has dropped off significantly as countries are looking to diversify, but mainly they no longer trust the good word of the US government. This chart here shows the top holders of US debt through October 2023, with Japan, China, and the UK holding the top 3 spots. And if we look a little closer at China's total by month, you will see that over the last 12 months, they have sold off $100 billion worth of US debt. This fits the narrative driven by China and other top emerging countries around the world that they're just trying to become more autonomous from the United States, as they feel like the global financial system is unfair to them. So they're taking action. Another action that these countries have been taking against the United States was probably one of the buzziest words from 2023, de-dollarization. How do you reduce your reliance on one specific currency? Yeah, it's simple, right? You just stop using it. Easier said than done. As I mentioned earlier, the United States is an investing juggernaut because countries have needed to hold the dollar. But those times are changing as the world is focusing on using local currencies for transactions that no longer involve the United States. And yes, that also means oil transactions, as Saudi Arabia has looked to trade in the Chinese yuan to certain countries. The United Arab Emirates and India have agreed to trade oil in their respective currencies, and Russian oil has almost exclusively sold in the Chinese yuan since the conflict with Ukraine has begun. And nowadays, it seems like every week there's a new report about 2 countries who plan to ditch the US dollar in place of their local currencies. A process that will speed up with things like digital currencies and new financial systems like BRICS Pay. But let's back up for a second. If you aren't aware, BRICS is a group of emerging countries led by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, who are at the forefront of creating a multipolar world separate from the Western nations. These 5 countries added 5 more countries to the bloc in 2024: Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And as these relationships continue to grow over time, it seems obvious that more and more agreements will be made to remove the dollar from all of their transactions. And BRICS Pay is a payment system specifically designed to simplify economic cooperation between the BRICS countries. It achieves this through a blend of traditional payment mechanisms and new technologies like central bank digital currencies. These transactions are facilitated, ensuring the highest level of transparency and security by recording each transaction on a blockchain. Not only are these countries reducing their need for the dollar with new technologies, things like BRICS Pay, but they're also ramping up one of the oldest methods when it comes to investing: gold. Over the last 30 years, central banks around the world have gone from gold sellers to gold buyers. And in 2022, central banks bought a record level of gold. And surprise, surprise, the country with the highest amount of gold purchased through October 2023 was China, which makes sense. They were the biggest seller of US debt in 2023 and bought gold to help replace it. Many people think that they're gearing up for a BRICS currency backed by gold. Other people think that they're waiting for one massive dump of all of their US debt exposure, some $700 billion. Let me know down in the comments decides what you think their strategy is. Either way, their message is clear. They are looking to diversify, but even though they hold the title of the world's largest buyer of gold, it still only makes up about 4% of their total asset reserves. And more gold buying is something we should all expect as we move into 2024 and beyond. According to a survey done by the World Gold Council, 7 out of 10 central banks believe gold reserves will increase over the next 12 months, and this is a percentage that went up 10% since last year. It's safe to say that countries are done with the dollar and they want to diversify, but there is way more to this story. I made a playlist talking about all things related to the global impact of US debt, like why this has been such a love-hate relationship for the world for so long, how can they get out of this vicious cycle, and what we can expect to see in the future. So if you're interested in this topic and want to find out more, make sure you check out this playlist here.